The alien officer dismissed the human as fragile. Then Steele spoke during the engagement. The Covenant of Worlds had a word for species that built warships before they had mastered faster-than-light travel. Kethra. Loosely translated, fragile ambition. The kind of creature that forges a blade before it understands the weight of consequence. Fleet Admiral Vorthson of the 3rd Covenant Expeditionary Arm had encountered 11 Kethra species across his 4-decade career. He had assessed their weapons, their formations, their psychological responses to first contact. And in every case the conclusion had been the same. Not cruelty. Not contempt. Simply calculation. Humans were the 12th. His intelligence officers had delivered the briefing packet 3 standard days before the Unbroken Meridian and her accompanying 7 vessels crossed into what the humans called the Cygnus Reach, a poorly named stretch of interstellar space roughly 40 light-years from Earth's outer defense perimeter. The packet was thorough. His analysts were always thorough. Bipedal. Carbon-based. Homeworld atmospheric pressure, 1.01 bar. Gravity, 9.8 meters per second squared. Average lifespan, 80 standard years. Technological tier, pre-cascade, sub-FTL drive capability. Military posture, reactive defensive, no confirmed offensive deep space doctrine. Vorthson had read the final line twice, not out of concern, but out of a professional habit of checking for errors. Threat classification, Category 3, low. Engagement threshold, minimal force recommended. He set the datapad down on the forward observation console and looked out through the command deck's primary view screen at the dark between stars. It had the stillness of a thing that had never been interrupted. That would change. The Covenant was not expanding for conquest. That was a critical distinction Vorthson held with genuine belief, not merely as official doctrine. They were expanding because the deep space gravitational surveys conducted 6 years prior had identified the Reach as a corridor, a narrow channel of manageable stellar density that connected Covenant core space to 3 candidate systems rich in heavy rare earth elements critical to the next generation of jump field emitters. Humanity's outer monitoring buoys sat directly in that corridor. The humans had been contacted via tight beam transmission 14 months ago. The Covenant's xenolinguistics team had used the mathematical language framework humanity itself had been broadcasting for 50 years, a reasonably clever approach for a pre-FTL species, Vorthson had acknowledged. The response had come quickly. Faster than expected, in fact. We understand your request. We are reviewing it. 14 months of review. No agreement. No formal refusal. Just review. Vorthson's diplomatic attaché, a soft-spoken Covenant scholar named Thessaly, had urged patience. They are a young species, Admiral. Their political structures are fragmented. Getting consensus takes time. 14 months, Vorthson had replied not unkindly, is not patience. It is scheduling. The expedition had been authorized under Covenant Statute 7, Article 14, the right of necessary transit. It was not an act of war. It was not intended as provocation. The Unbroken Meridian carried full diplomatic credentials, a legal observer team, and explicit orders to avoid engagement unless fired upon first. What it also carried, and this was simply procedural, not aggressive, was a full combat-ready battle group. 8 vessels. 4 capital ships. 2 destroyer escorts. 1 signals intelligence vessel. 1 repair tender. Standard expeditionary configuration for a Category 3 contact zone. Because even fragile ambitions sometimes made poor decisions under pressure. Vorthson reviewed the human ship registry his analysts had compiled. It was not a short list, which had mildly surprised him. Humanity had been busy in the 2 centuries since its industrial revolution achieved orbital capability. The outer defense perimeter alone showed 47 registered vessels, a mix of what his analysts classified as patrol frigates, medium cruisers, and 3 hulls designated dreadnought class by human naval taxonomy. He had looked at the dimensional specifications. A human dreadnought massed approximately 1.4 million metric tons, heavily armored by their standards. Railgun batteries with projectile velocities approaching 12 kilometers per second. Missile complement. Point defense clusters. Crew of 640. The Unbroken Meridian alone massed 22 million metric tons. Her main spinal cannon could put a round through 60 meters of hardened Covenant battle steel at combat range. Her crew complement was 4,300. He had not noted this comparison with pleasure. He had noted it the same way a structural engineer notes the load capacity of a bridge, clinically, because the numbers matter and sentiment does not change them. Admiral. His communications officer, Ensign Darrath, turned from her console. "We are receiving a transmission from the human monitoring station at Relay Post 7. Put it through." The voice that came through the bridge speakers was calm, measured. Vorthsen had a good ear for emotional subtext, even through translation filters, and what he heard in that voice was not fear. It was something quieter, more deliberate. "Covenant Expeditionary Fleet. This is Captain Yael Okonkwo, United Earth Defense Command, stationed at Cygnus Relay 7. You are entering a monitored zone under active defense review. We acknowledge your transit claim under interstellar precedent. We have not agreed to it. Please hold position pending formal response from the UEDC Joint Command. This request is made in the interest of preventing a misunderstanding that neither of our peoples can afford." Pause. "We know what your ships can do, Admiral. We're asking you to let diplomacy do what it's supposed to do before anyone finds out what ours can do." Vorthsen let the message finish. Around him, the bridge was quiet in the professional way, crew at their stations, eyes on their work but listening. Thessaly looked at him from the diplomatic station. "She has a point, Admiral." "She does," Vorthsen agreed. He let another moment pass. "She also said we know what your ships can do. Not we've read your specifications. Not we understand your capabilities. She said no." He looked at the human vessel signatures on the tactical overlay. 47 registered. His analyst had flagged another 11 as probable, smaller hulls running low-emission profiles, the kind of electromagnetic signature that looked like monitoring equipment if you weren't looking carefully. 58 then. Against 8. "Ensign Darath," he said. "Transmit acknowledgement. Standard courtesy format. We will hold position for 48 standard hours pending diplomatic contact from their joint command." 48 hours, sir? It's a reasonable window. He paused, then added something that was not standard protocol. "And pull up everything we have on human railgun sabo development in the last decade. The unclassified data and whatever the intelligence directorate has flagged. I want to read it tonight." The bridge returned to its routines. Vorthsen remained at the view screen. The stars did not move. The human ships did not move. But somewhere in that dark, Captain Yael Okonkwo was waiting, and she had chosen her words very carefully. "We know what your ships can do. Not we've heard. Not we've estimated. No." Vorthsen was a thorough man. And for the first time in this expedition he felt the specific discomfort of a professional who suspects his briefing packet may have missed something. He read until morning. 48 hours in interstellar space has a particular quality. There is no weather. No tide. No biological clock that the void respects. Time becomes purely administrative, tracked by ship chronometers, measured by shift rotations, marked by nothing except the work being done within it. Captain Yael Okonkwo spent those 48 hours doing what she had spent the last 6 years of her career doing, thinking about a war she was not authorized to start but had been quietly preparing to survive. Cygnus Relay 7 was not, technically speaking, a weapons platform. It was a monitoring station. That distinction was important in international, and increasingly interstellar, law, because monitoring stations carried a different legal classification than military installations, and the Covenant's transit claim specifically invoked interstellar precedent that applied to uninhabited or non-military zones. The United Earth Defense Command legal team had caught that clause 14 months ago, on day 3 of their review. So Relay 7 was technically a monitoring station. It had monitoring equipment. It monitored things. The fact that 3 of its 6 large array dishes had been quietly refit 18 months ago to serve as fire control radar systems for the long-range rail platforms embedded in the 3 asteroids within 40,000 kilometers of the station, that was a separate matter entirely. The platforms were classified. The asteroids were not broadcasting. They simply existed as asteroids do in the cold dark. Captain Okonkwo had not mentioned the asteroids in her transmission. She stood now in Relay 7's cramped tactical center. 4 crew stations, 2 wall screens, and a coffee machine that had been broken for 6 weeks, reviewing the passive sensor feed from her outer picket line. The Covenant fleet had held position as promised. 8 vessels in a loose formation her tactical officer, Lieutenant Pham, had described as textbook expedition anchor pattern. "They're not powering weapons," Pham said, not looking up from his console. "Shields on standby. Drives at minimal thrust. They are genuinely just sitting there." "I know," Okonkwo said. "That's actually kind of reassuring. It means they're disciplined," she said. "Disciplined is better than nervous." She paused. "Nervous is when people make mistakes." The Joint Command response had come in at hour 19. Not a negotiation team. Not a formal diplomatic delegation. Instead, a terse 6-paragraph directive that told her exactly what she already knew. Hold position, do not escalate, do not make any commitments regarding transit rights, and be advised that UEDC Battlegroup Serrano was currently 18 hours out at best sustainable cruise speed. Admiral Serrano. Elena Serrano, to anyone who had worked with her before the rank made formality mandatory. The woman who had spent 8 years writing the UEDC's current First Contact Engagement Doctrine, a document that was, depending on your perspective, either the most carefully constructed diplomatic framework in human history or the most elaborately disguised threat assessment ever officially published. Possibly both. Okonkwo had read it 3 times. There was a section in Chapter 9, Asymmetric Contact Scenarios, that she found herself thinking about now. The species most dangerous in a first contact military scenario is not the one with superior firepower. It is the one with superior intelligence gathering adequate firepower, and the institutional patience to use the former before deploying the latter. History consistently shows that the party that understands the battlefield before the engagement begins dictates its terms. Okonkwo looked at the Covenant fleet on her screen. They had superior firepower. No question. The mass displacement readings alone told that story without ambiguity. The unbroken meridian was large enough that her passive thermal signature looked, on long-range sensors, like a small moon making course corrections. But understanding the battlefield? That was a different question. She pulled up the file her intelligence officer had assembled over the past 6 years, not a classified deep ops product, just the accumulation of careful observation. Every emission signature logged. Every communication pattern analyzed. Every tactical formation documented across 37 separate Covenant fleet interactions and other contact zones, reconstructed from reports shared among Earth's growing network of deep space monitoring stations. The Covenant fought in a particular way. Confident in their capital ship mass advantage, they tended to anchor their formation around their largest hull and work outward. Layered defense, concentrated firepower, predictable geometry. Against opponents who fought the same way, it was devastatingly effective. Against opponents who didn't fight that way at all, the picture was more complicated. The UEDC had spent the last decade not building a fleet that could match Covenant tonnage. That was a race humanity could not win, not in any time frame that mattered. Instead, the doctrine that Serrano had written, and that 17 yards across 4 continents had been quietly building toward for 8 years, focused on a different question entirely. Not, can we destroy their ships? But, can we make destroying our ships cost more than they're willing to pay? Railgun platforms and asteroid fields. Distributed fire control networks. Long-range missile salvos programmed for terminal evasion maneuvers that Covenant point defense systems had never seen, because they had been designed by studying Covenant point defense response times and working backward. Stealth-hulled picket ships running so cold they barely registered on thermal sensors. And a command and control architecture that was decentralized enough that destroying any single node, even a flagship, would not collapse the response. Okonkwo had once asked Admiral Serrano at a strategy conference 3 years ago whether she thought the doctrine would actually work if it came to that. Serrano had been quiet for a moment, in the way that people are quiet when they are choosing between an honest answer and a useful one. I think, Serrano had finally said, that if the Covenant ever seriously analyzes our full defensive posture, they will conclude that the cost of forcing transit is higher than the value of the corridor. I think we've made the math uncomfortable for them. And if they haven't analyzed it carefully enough? Another pause. Then we find out together. Hour 31 of the hold window. Lieutenant Pham broke the quiet. Captain. We're getting something from the Covenant flagship. Transmission. No ma'am. Active sensor sweep. Narrowband. High resolution. He looked up. They're scanning the asteroid field. Okonkwo felt something settle in her chest, not fear. The specific focused clarity that comes when a situation begins moving in a direction you planned for. Are they getting anything useful? Pham checked his readings. Our EM shielding on the platforms is holding. They'd see rock and residual thermal variance. Pause. But whoever's doing the scan knows what they're looking for. This isn't a standard navigational sweep. They're being methodical. So the Admiral had done his homework overnight. Good. That was actually the better outcome. A careful enemy was a predictable one. Log the scan, Okonkwo said. And get me a secure channel to Serrano's group. I want to give her a full picture before she arrives. She looked at the Covenant fleet sitting patient and enormous in the dark. They were starting to look more carefully. Good. Let them look. Let them count the asteroids, measure the distances, calculate the fields of fire. Let them do the math. Admiral Elena Serrano arrived at hour 46, 2 hours ahead of her estimated transit time. This was not accidental. UEDC Battle Group Serrano, 5 vessels, the carrier cruiser Resolute Horizon, 2 heavy frigates, 1 destroyer and a signal support ship, had been running at 108% rated thrust for the last 11 hours, a decision that would require drive inspection before the next deployment but which placed Serrano's ships at the edge of the Relay 7 monitoring zone with 94 minutes to spare before the Covenant's hold window expired. Serrano had made Admiral by understanding that 94 minutes was not a luxury. It was a statement. Okonkwo met her at the docking collar with a handshake and a data chip. No ceremony. Serrano took the chip, slotted it into her personal console while still walking down the boarding tube, and read the last 18 hours of intelligence summary before her feet touched Relay 7's deck. They scan the asteroids, she said. Hour 31. Methodical. High-res. Did they get anything? Nothing definitive. But they know something's there. Serrano stopped walking. She was a compact woman, mid-50s, with the kind of posture that came from years of carrier command where the corridors were too low to slouch in. She looked at Okonkwo for a moment with the particular expression of someone running calculations. Good, she said finally. That's actually what we need. Okonkwo had heard this before, the Serrano doctrine reduced to a single word. Good. Not in the sense of pleasant. In the sense of useful. A Covenant fleet that suspected what was in those asteroids and chose diplomacy over force was a Covenant fleet that had done the math and found the answer uncomfortable. That was the entire design. What you could not control was a fleet that didn't know the math existed. The formal contact session was scheduled for hour 48 on the dot. Covenant precision apparently extended to courtesy windows. At exactly the appointed time, the unbroken meridian transmitted a hail request on the previously established frequency. Standard opening protocol, identification, credentials, proposed agenda. Serrano took the call from Relay 7's command center, with Okonkwo beside her and a translation team of 3 working in real time. Fleet Admiral Vorithson appeared on the main screen. He was tall by human standards. Approximately 2 meters with a build that suggested significant gravity in his evolutionary history. His species' facial structure was angular, asymmetrical in a way that human visual processing initially found difficult to categorize. 4 years of Covenant contact had given the translation team enough paralinguistic data to calibrate emotional readings with reasonable confidence. The Admiral looked, the team's senior analyst quietly noted, like someone who had not slept well. Admiral Serrano, the translation rendered his opening in clean, slightly formal English. The Covenant's xenolinguistic systems had been working on human language for 14 months too. Thank you for joining us within the agreed window. I appreciate the effort your transit required. That last sentence was the tell. He had noticed the 108% thrust signature. Of course he had. Admiral Vorithson, Serrano replied, her tone even and direct. We take our commitments seriously. I hope that's noted. It is. A pause, fractional but real. I'll be direct, Admiral. The Covenant's transit claim is lawful under established interstellar framework. Our survey data indicates the Cygnus Reach corridor as the most efficient route to the candidate systems our expansion requires. We have no territorial claim on this space. We have no interest in conflict with your people. We are asking for passage. I understand the claim, Serrano said. I understand the law you're citing. What I need you to understand, clearly, Admiral, so there's no ambiguity, is that the legal framework you're invoking was written before first contact with humanity. It does not currently have a mechanism for the consent of established presences in a transit corridor. Humanity has no territorial claim to the reach under current framework, correct. Serrano did not raise her voice. I'm telling you that framework is incomplete. I'm telling you that we are willing to negotiate a formal transit agreement, one that gives the Covenant what it needs while establishing the principle that human consent is required for passage through zones where we have active assets. She let that settle for a moment. Active assets being a diplomatic term, Admiral. I want to be precise. Another pause. Longer this time. The translation team lead leaned toward Okonkwo and murmured, barely audible. He understood the implication. Vorithson spoke again. You are proposing a formal treaty framework. I'm proposing that we spend the next 72 hours working toward one, yes. With the understanding that your fleet holds its current position and that both sides maintain restraint while our diplomatic teams work. And if a framework cannot be agreed in that time? Serrano's expression did not change. Then we'll need more time. Because the alternative to a framework is a situation that I am confident neither of us wants to manage. was not a threat. It was the honest assessment of someone who had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this conversation and knew, with the cold clarity of a structural engineer, what the bridge could and could not hold. Vorthson looked at her for a long moment. Behind him, Okonkwo could see, just barely, the shapes of Covenant Bridge crew at their stations. The body language read, through the translation team's lens, as attentive. Careful. 72 hours, Vorthson said. The Covenant will hold position. Thank you, Admiral. The channel closed. The command center was quiet for a moment. Lieutenant Pham looked up from his console. Did that just work? Phase 1, Serrano said. She turned to the tactical display. Pull up the full sensor picture. I want to know if his fleet moved anything in the last 10 seconds. It hadn't. Not a drive flicker, not a shield fluctuation. Okonkwo found herself thinking about the scan at hour 31, the careful, methodical sweep of the asteroid field. The admiral who hadn't slept. The man who had arrived believing he was navigating a Category 3 encounter and had spent 2 days quietly revising that assessment. He was still revising it, she suspected. Let him. Let him count every asteroid. Let him model every possible firing solution from every platform his analysts had flagged as probable. Let him run the engagement scenarios until the numbers stopped being comfortable. Not because humanity wanted a war, but because the only thing that reliably prevented one was making the alternative legible. Outside, in the vast cold dark of the Cygnus Reach, 8 Covenant warships held their position. And in 3 asteroids nearby, very patient, very quiet, very precisely aimed rail platforms waited in the silence they had been designed to keep. Diplomacy between species who have never met before shares a specific structural problem with surgery. The most dangerous moment is not the crisis you planned for, but the small, unexpected thing that happens while everyone is focused on the obvious. The diplomatic teams worked in adjacent virtual conference spaces, Covenant and human translators building a shared lexicon in real time while the senior negotiators worked through the substantive questions. On the Covenant side, Thessaly and 2 legal scholars whose names the human team spent the first 3 hours learning to pronounce correctly. On the human side, Dr. Rania Holt, UEDC's chief first contact diplomat, and 2 specialists from the newly established Office of Interstellar Affairs whose combined experience in actual alien negotiation was, as of 72 hours ago, precisely 0. This was not a weakness Holt advertised. The core issue was elegant in its simplicity and genuinely complex in its resolution. The Covenant's transit claim was legally coherent under a framework that had been developed by the 7 species of the Inner Covenant over 3 centuries. It was thorough, thoughtful law, designed to prevent exactly the kind of resource conflict that had historically destabilized younger multi-species regions. The problem was that it had been written entirely by and for species that already knew each other, and its provisions for encountering a new spacefaring civilization amounted to essentially classify them, assess their threat tier, and proceed accordingly. Humanity had been classified as Category 3, low threat, minimal force. Dr. Holt had obtained a copy of the threat classification system during the first negotiating session. The Covenant legal team had shared it without apparent awareness that doing so might be counterproductive. She had read through it quietly, made no comment, and passed it to her team with a single annotation in the margin. They think we don't know what this says about us. Don't correct them yet. Because the classification system also, helpfully, specified exactly what criteria would trigger a reclassification. And while Holt had no intention of threatening anyone, understanding the classification thresholds meant understanding which pieces of information to introduce carefully, and when. At hour 14 of negotiations, Covenant legal scholar Arvith, the senior of the 2 whose command of translated English had reached near fluency, raised what she called a technical concern. The monitoring assets your Captain Okonkwo referenced, Arvith said. In your relay zone. Our survey data does not show significant infrastructure in the corridor proper. Could you clarify what assets you mean? Holt had prepared for this question. She glanced at her assistant, who pulled up a document on the shared display, a summary, carefully curated, of the UEDC's publicly registered assets in the Cygnus Reach zone. Relay stations, navigation buoys, scientific survey drones. 3 registered patrol corridors. All real. All accurate. All representing roughly 40% of what was actually out there. These are our registered assets in the zone, Holt said. As you can see, we have significant ongoing scientific and navigational infrastructure that would require coordination to route around. That's what we mean by active presence. A transit agreement would need to account for safe passage corridors, signal deconfliction, and emergency response protocols. Arvith reviewed the document. "This is substantive," she said, with the slightly surprised quality of someone whose briefing had said minimal infrastructure. "We've been busy," Holt said pleasantly. At hour 27, the small unexpected thing happened. One of the Covenant destroyer escorts, designated CDV-7 in UEDC tactical nomenclature, Righteous Current in its own registry, experienced what its crew later described as a navigational systems test that produced an unintended drive pulse. A brief, 4-second burn at approximately 8% thrust. Enough to move the ship approximately 340 meters from its holding position. 340 meters, in the context of interstellar space, is nothing. In the context of the specific geometry of the Cygnus Reach monitoring zone, it was enough to briefly, marginally cross an unmarked threshold that UEDC tactical protocols defined as the inner monitoring boundary. Every human sensor platform in range registered the movement. Every fire control system ran an automatic threat assessment. 3 of the asteroid-embedded rail platforms ran a targeting solution that took 1.1 seconds to complete, faster than any human operator could have authorized a response. The rail platforms did not fire. They were not authorized to fire on threshold crossings of this type. The protocols were clear. But Lieutenant Pham on Relay 7 watched the automated targeting cycle complete and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the station's air recycling. He flagged it immediately to Captain Okonkwo. Okonkwo flagged it to Serrano. Serrano did 3 things in rapid sequence. She confirmed the Righteous Current was returning to position. It was, immediately, with what looked like an embarrassed drive correction. She flagged the incident to the diplomatic team with instructions to log it but not raise it unless the Covenant did. And she filed a quiet internal incident report that noted for the record that the automated fire control response time on the rail platforms had been 1.1 seconds. The Covenant, she noted, probably didn't know that. She updated her threat assessment to include the information that 4-second navigational errors could produce automated targeting solutions faster than a human commander could consciously respond. That was a vulnerability in the current protocol that she needed to address before this situation resolved, in either direction. At hour 41, Thessaly asked Holt a question that was not about the treaty. "Your Admiral Serrano," Thessaly said, during a brief recess where the negotiators were drinking their respective beverages in companionable silence. "She arrived 2 hours early." "She did. That required significant drive stress." "It did." Thessaly considered this. "I have studied human historical military literature, as part of my preparation for this contact. I read about a concept you call presence. The idea that arrival itself communicates intention, even before words are exchanged." Holt looked at her. "That's a good reading of it. Admiral Serrano arrived early to communicate that your fleet takes its commitments seriously. That you could be relied upon." Thessaly paused. "But also that you could move faster than expected." Holt said nothing. "Both messages at once," Thessaly said quietly. That is actually quite elegant." The treaty framework took shape slowly, the way such things do when both parties are simultaneously trying to be fair and trying to protect their own position. By hour 60, they had agreed on 3 of 7 core provisions. By hour 75, the 2 remaining provisions, regarding advanced notification requirements for Covenant transits and the legal status of UEDC monitoring assets in the corridor, were the genuinely hard ones. But they were making progress. In the dark outside, the fleets held their positions. The rail platforms tracked their designated arcs in silence. And somewhere in the careful architecture of the negotiation, both sides were beginning to understand something that the Category 3 classification had not anticipated. Humanity had not been busy building a military to fight the galaxy. It had been busy making sure the galaxy understood that fighting it would not be simple. The treaty almost died at hour 71. Not because of politics. Not because of disagreement over legal language. Because of a piece of debris, a miscalibrated sensor, and the specific cruelty of automated systems operating faster than the humans trying to manage them. A fragment of what post-incident analysis confirmed was a micrometeorite impact on one of the navigation buoys at the outer edge of the Relay 7 zone produced, briefly, an electromagnetic pulse consistent with, not identical to but consistent with, the firing signature of a human railgun platform. The UEDC sensors categorized it correctly within 4 seconds. The Covenant sensors, which were calibrated for Covenant weapon signatures, took 11 seconds to reach the same conclusion. In those 11 seconds, 3 things happened simultaneously. The unbroken Meridian's defensive grid went to active standby, not weapons hot, but shields raised, point defense systems cycling from standby to tracking mode. A status that, on UEDC passive sensors, looked exactly like what you expected to see immediately before a capital ship opened fire. Captain Okonkwo, watching the Covenant flagship's energy signature spike on her tactical screen, made a decision in approximately 3 seconds. She opened a direct channel, not through diplomatic protocols, not through the formal communication framework, but through the emergency contact frequency that had been established in the first hour of negotiations precisely because Dr. Holt had insisted on it, and spoke directly to the Unbroken Meridian's bridge. Covenant flagship. This is Captain Okonkwo UEDC. We have a false reading, repeat, false reading, on our outer buoy network. Micrometeorite impact on buoy 7 Alpha. Your sensors may be showing a weapons signature. It is not a weapons signature. We are transmitting the raw sensor data to your tactical channel now. Please confirm receipt. The transmission took 0.4 seconds to reach the Unbroken Meridian at the current separation. The response took 6 seconds. UEDC Relay 7. This is Unbroken Meridian Tactical Operations. We have received your transmission. Reviewing raw data now. 4 more seconds. Confirmed. False reading. Standing down defensive grid. Pause. Captain Okonkwo. Thank you for the immediate transmission. 11 seconds total. Beginning to end. On the Unbroken Meridian's bridge, Vorthson reviewed the sequence personally. He had been in his flag cabin when the alert came through. He had moved to the bridge in time to see the defensive grid go active and to watch his tactical officer reach the correct interpretation of the raw data at roughly the same moment that Captain Okonkwo's voice came through the emergency channel. He sat in the command chair for a long moment after the stand-down. She transmitted before we asked, his tactical officer said. Yes. She transmitted before our sensors had resolved the reading. She did. She was watching us and she knew what our sensors would see before we did. Pause. And she acted to prevent an escalation before we could even ask for one. Vorthson said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the briefing packet. Category 3. Low threat. Reactive defensive, no confirmed offensive deep space doctrine. Reactive defensive. Technically accurate. But the thing about reactive systems designed by people who had thought very carefully about every possible input, they weren't slow. They were fast in ways that looked like anticipation. Get me everything our analysts have on human command structure, he said quietly. Specifically, I want to know how Captain Okonkwo had authorization to use that emergency channel without going through the diplomatic team. The answer came back 40 minutes later. She didn't need authorization. The emergency channel protocol gave any commanding officer in the contact zone unilateral authority to use direct communication to prevent imminent escalation. It was signed into the contact framework at hour 1 of the negotiations. Holt had insisted on it. Holt, the diplomat, had built a back-channel de-escalation pathway into the communication architecture before the substantive discussions even started. Because she had anticipated that the most dangerous moment in the next 72 hours would not be a disagreement over treaty language. It would be a sensor anomaly or a navigation error or a piece of debris, some small mechanical accident that happened faster than formal protocols could respond to. Vorthson added Dr. Rania Holt to the mental file he was building, the one that had started with Admiral Serrano's early arrival and grown steadily more detailed over the past 3 days. In the diplomatic suite, Holt was already back at the table. She had received the incident report from Okonkwo simultaneously with its transmission, had read it in 15 seconds, and had then done something her Covenant counterparts found slightly bewildering. She had immediately resumed the discussion of Provision 6, the advance notification requirement, exactly where they had left off. No drama. No acknowledgement of how close the situation had come to collapsing. Thessaly, who had been present for the alert and the stand-down, had sat quietly for a moment and then followed Holt's lead, returning her attention to the treaty language. Afterward, during another recess, she asked about it. You didn't want to address what just happened? Holt looked at her with an expression that was honest and, Thessaly thought, faintly tired. We built the system so that what just happened could be resolved in 11 seconds, she said. If it had needed to be discussed, that would mean the system hadn't worked. It worked. So we continue. Thessaly was quiet. Then, you built a de-escalation protocol because you knew we might misread one of your sensor events. We knew someone might misread something. Doesn't matter which side. You anticipated your own system's failure modes. We anticipated every system's failure modes. Holt picked up her stylus. That's what the last 14 months were actually for. Thessaly looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone deeply revising a prior assessment. Dr. Holt, she said. May I ask, When your analysts were reviewing our transit claim 14 months ago, what were they actually doing? Holt considered the question carefully. The honest answer was, building the contact framework, designing the communication protocols, mapping the Covenant's known sensor capabilities, stress testing every escalation scenario they could model, identifying every point of potential mechanical failure, and writing a treaty template that had already gone through 4 draft versions before the Covenant fleet left their home system. What she said was, preparing. One word. The same weight as a dreadnought. Outside, the emergency channel sat open and quiet on both fleets' communication systems. A thread of trust, thin and functional, connecting 2 civilizations across the dark. It had worked. The Cygnus Transit Accord was initialed at hour 89, 17 hours past the original 72-hour window, extended by mutual agreement without drama at the deadline. It was 4 pages in Covenant legal notation. 11 in human. The difference in length was itself a kind of artifact. The Covenant's legal framework was older, more compressed, more reliant on understood precedent. The human version specified everything, because humanity had no shared precedent with the Covenant yet, and Dr. Holt had decided that ambiguity was a cost neither side could currently afford. Provision 1. The Covenant acknowledged the UEDC's active presence in the Cygnus Reach Zone as constituting a legitimate stakeholder interest under the amended interstellar framework, a framework that both parties agreed would require formal updating by the broader Covenant Assembly. Provision 2. Transit rights through the Reach were granted to Covenant vessels under a 60-day advance notification requirement, with UEDC escort protocol for the first 6 transits. Provision 3. Both parties committed to a joint survey of the corridor within 1 standard year, with the survey results shared equally and transit rights reviewed against actual asset distribution. Provisions 4 through 7 covered communication protocols, incident response, scientific data sharing, and, the one that had taken the longest, the legal status question. It was not, Vorotson noted privately, everything the Covenant had come for. They had transit rights but conditional ones. The notification requirement and the escort protocol were, practically speaking, an acknowledgement that humanity had a meaningful say in this corridor in ways that Category 3 did not anticipate. He would have to file a formal supplementary assessment to the Covenant's Expansion Directorate recommending an upward reclassification. He had started drafting it on day 2. What he had not expected, what the briefing packet had not prepared him for, was the specific texture of the human diplomatic approach. It was not what he associated with younger species. Most Category 3 contacts followed a recognizable pattern. Initial uncertainty, oscillation between deference and overreach, attempts to impress through capability demonstration. Look at our weapons. Look at our numbers. See how serious we are. The humans had done almost none of that. They had not demonstrated weapons. They had not made explicit threats. They had not even raised their voice as a fleet, in any way that could be formally logged as a provocation. What they had done was build a situation in which every piece of information Vorotson gathered on his own, the asteroid scans, the drive thrust profiles, the emergency channel protocol, the response time of 11 seconds on a false alarm, pointed toward a conclusion that no human had stated aloud. We have thought about this more carefully than you have. We have been preparing for longer than you know. And we would strongly prefer not to demonstrate any of this further. That was the message. Delivered entirely in architecture and behavior, never in words. Vorotson signed the accord with Admiral Serrano in a brief ceremony conducted over secure video link, with both diplomatic teams present and the translation systems running clean. The formalities were brief. Serrano was not a ceremonial commander by nature, and the Covenant tradition for treaty signing was similarly restrained, a practical acknowledgement that the hard work was done and the words were now binding. Admiral, Serrano said at the end of the ceremony, I want to say something off the record if that's acceptable. Vorotson signaled his assent. This didn't have to take 11 days, she said. The legal framework you were citing was genuinely coherent. If your transit claim had come through formal diplomatic channels before your fleet moved, we might have resolved this in a week of correspondence. She paused. I'm not saying that to assign blame. I'm saying it because I think it's important that we're honest with each other about process going forward. We're going to be neighbors. The mechanics matter. Vorotson was quiet for a moment. You are correct, he said. The decision to proceed with the fleet's movement while diplomatic review was ongoing was, I will say it plainly, a miscalculation of your response posture. I appreciate that. May I say something in return, also off the record? Serrano nodded once. The Category 3 classification your people received from our intelligence directorate, he said. I filed a formal objection to it this morning. Not based on your weapons inventory. Not based on fleet tonnage. He looked at her directly through the screen. Based on institutional behavior. The advanced notification requirement you built into Provision 2. There is an older Covenant species, the Tavari, who required 43 years of contact and 2 military engagements before they understood why notification mattered. You required 14 months and no engagement. Pause. That is not Category 3 behavior. Serrano held his gaze for a moment. What category is it? Vorthson considered his answer carefully. In Covenant classification schema, Category 1 and 2 were reserved for species capable of threatening Covenant core systems. He was not filing that. Not yet. A new category, he said. I am recommending we create one. After the ceremony concluded and the screens went dark, Serrano sat alone in Relay 7's small briefing room for a few minutes, the kind of quiet she permitted herself after high-stakes operations resolved. She thought about the asteroid platforms. About Okonkwo's 11-second transmission. About 14 months of careful preparation that had been designed to make this exact conversation possible, and to make the alternative conversation unacceptably expensive. She thought about the young officer who had asked her, 3 years ago, whether the doctrine would actually work. She picked up her communicator and sent a message back to UEDC Joint Command. Short, factual, no dramatics. Accord signed. Transit framework established. Recommend immediate review of reach assets for next phase planning. The Covenant will come back, with more ships, more surveys, and considerably more respect for our infrastructure. We should be ready to negotiate from the same position. Also recommend, buy Dr. Holt a very good dinner. In the dark outside, the Covenant fleet began the slow process of moving to transit formation. Not rushing, not retreating, simply proceeding with the careful deliberateness of a civilization that had just encountered something it would need to think about for a long time. In the asteroid field, the rail platforms continued their quiet arcs. Patient. Precise. Silent. The unbroken meridian's transit through the Cygnus Reach took 11 days. Not because the corridor was physically difficult to navigate, at Covenant cruise speed, the distance involved was a matter of days. But Vorthson had requested, and Serrano had approved, a reduced velocity transit that allowed for the joint survey work specified in Provision 3 of the Accord. 2 Covenant science ships operated alongside a UEDC survey vessel, sharing data, building the common map of the corridor that both parties now had a legal interest in. Vorthson used those 11 days to write his report. Formal contact assessments were a bureaucratic tradition in Covenant expansion operations, a standardized document designed to give the Expansion Directorate and the Diplomatic Corps a clear picture of the encountered species, their capabilities, their behavior, their likely trajectory, and the recommended posture for ongoing relations. He had written 11 of them. They tended to follow a predictable structure. This one did not. He started, as always, with capability assessment. He listed the confirmed assets, 47 registered UEDC vessels in and near the contact zone, the 3 embedded rail platforms, confirmed by post-accord disclosure at Serrano's direction, a trust-building gesture that Vorthson had noted carefully, the distributed fire control network, the passive monitoring systems, the emergency communication architecture. He was precise and complete. Then he wrote the section he had been thinking about since hour 2 of the hold window. Observed behavioral characteristics, human military doctrine. Human military doctrine in the contact scenario did not conform to expected Category 3 patterns. The following characteristics are specifically noted for the record of the Expansion Directorate and are recommended for immediate review. 1. Preparation timeline versus public posture. The assets observed in the Cygnus Reach contact zone reflect a minimum of 8 years of sustained, systematic preparation for a first contact military scenario. This preparation was conducted without public announcement, without diplomatic provocation, and without any action that would have triggered earlier contact or elevated threat assessment. The humans prepared quietly and waited. This is not reactive behavior. It is strategic patience. 2. Layered disclosure. At no point during the contact scenario did UEDC representatives reveal the full extent of their defensive posture. Asset disclosure was graduated, enough to establish credibility, not enough to reveal the full system. Post-accord disclosure was used as a diplomatic tool. This reflects a sophisticated understanding of information asymmetry in negotiation. 3. System design philosophy. The human defensive architecture observed in this contact appears designed not to win an engagement, but to make an engagement prohibitively costly. Rail platforms and asteroid fields are inherently defensive. The Fire Control Network's distributed architecture is designed to survive the destruction of any single node. The emergency communication channel is designed to prevent accidental escalation. Every component I observed was oriented toward deterrence, not offense. They built a system to make the cost of attacking them higher than any conceivable gain. They succeeded. 4. Institutional coherence. The most significant factor observed was not any individual capability but the coherence of the human response across military, diplomatic, and technical functions. Admiral Serrano, Captain Okonkwo, and Dr. Holt operated with clearly aligned objectives and clearly differentiated roles. There was no visible tension between military and diplomatic personnel. The emergency channel protocol shows that this alignment extended to procedural architecture. They had designed their own system's failure modes into the communication framework before the negotiations began. This level of institutional integration is not characteristic of Category 3 species. In my experience, it is not common at any category. He paused there, reread what he had written, and added one more paragraph. Personal observation for the record. I arrived in the Cygnus Reach believing I was managing a transit dispute with a pre-FTL species in a Category 3 contact zone. I had read the briefing packet. The briefing packet was accurate in its facts and incorrect in its conclusions. Humanity cannot match Covenant fleet tonnage. They cannot match our drive technology, our weapons range, or our operational depth. These things remain true. But they are not, I have concluded, the relevant measures for assessing this species. The relevant measure is this: humanity spent 8 years preparing for a first contact they could not predict, with a civilization they had never met, using technology that was genuinely inferior, and they built a response architecture that made the question of their inferiority largely irrelevant. They didn't try to match us. They tried to make matching them unnecessary. I have spent 40 years assessing species across 11 contact scenarios. I have never written a report that required me to create a new category. I am creating one now. Recommended classification. Category 1 emerging. A species that does not yet possess Covenanteer capabilities but has demonstrated the institutional, strategic, and doctrinal sophistication to develop them, and the patience and discipline to be dangerous well before that development is complete. Recommended posture. Treat as a peer in all diplomatic and operational contexts. Do not mistake technological gap for strategic gap. Do not mistake restraint for incapacity. Do not mistake quiet for harmless. The report was filed with the Expansion Directorate on Day 9 of the transit. It reached the Covenant Assembly's Standing Diplomatic Committee on Day 14. On Day 21, in a session that Vorthson would learn about much later from a junior attaché who had been present and found the whole thing remarkable, a senior assembly member had read the final paragraph aloud and then sat in silence for almost a full minute before speaking. How long, the assembly member had finally asked, did they say they've been building toward this? Admiral Vorthson estimates 8 years minimum, the committee chair had answered. Possibly longer. The infrastructure suggests a longer timeline. Another silence. And they never escalated. They never made a threat. They just built. Yes. The assembly member had looked at the report for another long moment and then said something that did not make it into the official minutes but that the junior attaché remembered clearly. I would very much like to know what they're building now. On Earth, the Cygnus Transit Accord was publicly announced on a Tuesday. The press conference was brief. Admiral Serrano answered questions for 22 minutes, confirmed that a transit framework had been established, confirmed that no engagement had occurred, and described the outcome as a productive first step in what we expect to be a long and complex diplomatic relationship. A journalist near the back asked whether humanity should be worried about the Covenant. Serrano considered the question with the patience of someone who had been preparing an answer to it for 8 years. The Covenant is a sophisticated, powerful, and, based on my direct experience, professionally conducted civilization, she said. We should take them seriously, engage with them honestly, and never stop preparing. Pause. That's not specific to the Covenant. That's just good policy. The press conference ended. The cameras packed up. The diplomats filed their paperwork. In the Cygnus Reach, the corridor sat quiet under the old light of distant stars. And in 3 asteroids, patient as geology, the rail platforms continued their silent arcs. Waiting. Not for a war. For whatever came next.